The moment she said it out loud, standing there with her arms crossed like a judge who had already reached a verdict, I understood that I wasn't being invited into a discussion so much as being informed of my own demotion, because when someone opens a marriage the way she did, with impatience flickering behind their eyes and relief already leaking into their voice, it becomes painfully obvious that the door had been unlocked long before you were told it existed. She told me we needed to be honest with ourselves, that monogamy had started to feel dishonest to her, that love wasn't meant to be confined, and she said all of this while pacing the living room we picked together, glancing at her phone between sentences in a way that made every word feel rehearsed rather than brave. And when I asked her whether this was something she wanted or something she had already started living, she sighed like I had asked a tedious question she had hoped to avoid. She told me I was being defensive, that my hesitation proved I was afraid of growth. And then she said, with a softness that felt crueler than anger ever could, that she already had someone in mind, but that it didn't mean she loved me any less, which was when the room tilted slightly, and I realized that what was being opened wasn't our marriage, but the exit she had been quietly carving for herself, while I was still fixing cracks I thought we both cared about. I remember standing there, listening to her explain how this would finally make us honest, how jealousy was a learned response, how I could have my own experiences too if I wanted, and how she framed all of it as generosity instead of the ultimatum it clearly was, because the subtext sat heavy between us, unspoken but undeniable, telling me that my consent was more about compliance than agreement. When I asked her whether she would stop if I said no, she didn't answer right away, and in that pause I saw the truth settle into her posture, because her shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't in months, and she admitted that she didn't think going back was possible anymore, that this was where she was headed whether I walked alongside her or not. And she said my name the way people do when they are trying to sound compassionate, while preparing to disappoint you deeply. I felt something shift inside me then, not rage but a hollowing, the sudden clarity that I wasn't losing her to another person, so much as realizing I had already been replaced by an idea of freedom that did not include me as anything more than emotional furniture she wasn't ready to throw out yet. I left before the conversation could officially end, because staying would have required pretending I still had leverage, and the night air hit me with a sharpness that felt earned as I walked without direction, replaying her words until they lost coherence and became a dull hum of rejection instead. I sat on a curb a few blocks away and stared at the screen of my phone like it might explain what had just happened, and when it buzzed with her sister's name, I almost ignored it out of instinct rather than logic, because the last thing I wanted was another reminder of the life I was apparently being phased out of. Her message was careful, asking where I was, saying she had heard there was a fight, offering a ride because she didn't think I should be walking alone this late. And there was something in the restraint of her concern that cut deeper than my wife's polished certainty had, because it felt like genuine attention rather than damage control. When she pulled up beside me a few minutes later, the car idling softly as the door unlocked, the silence that followed was thick with everything neither of us was supposed to acknowledge. And as I slid into the passenger seat, I became acutely aware of how long it had been since someone looked at me without already deciding what they needed from me next. She didn't ask for details right away, and instead she talked about neutral things, about traffic and the cold and how late it had gotten, giving me space that felt intentional rather than awkward. And when she finally said she was sorry in a voice that carried weight instead of performance, something in my chest tightened in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. I noticed the way her hand rested on the steering wheel, steady and relaxed, and the way her eyes flicked toward me when she thought I wasn't looking, and I hated myself for registering those details because they reminded me of how starved I had become for uncomplicated presence, for being seen without being managed. As the city lights slid past the windows and the distance between my old certainty and this new, unfamiliar quiet stretched thin, I realized that whatever my wife had opened back in that living room had already started closing around me in ways I did not yet understand, and that the first person to notice me falling through it wasn't the woman I married, but the one person I was never supposed to see this clearly. She didn't pull up like someone sent on an errand, and she didn't roll the window down to call my name like I was a stray that needed rounding up, because she parked, killed the headlights, and just sat there for a beat as if she was giving me the dignity of deciding whether I wanted to be found at all. And when I finally opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, the warmth hit my face along with the faint scent of her shampoo and clean laundry, which felt weirdly intimate for a moment that was supposed to be strictly practical. She kept her eyes forward as she eased back onto the road, and the silence between us had teeth, not because it was awkward, but because it was loaded, and I could feel a question pressing against the inside of my throat that I didn't want to ask, because once I asked it, it would become real. After a few blocks, she said my name softly, not as a prompt, not as pity, but as recognition, and then she added, "I'm not here to interrogate you, but I'm also not going to pretend I didn't hear enough to know you're not okay." And something about the steadiness in her voice made my hands unclench for the first time since the argument started. I stared out at the streetlights smearing across the glass and tried to find a version of the evening that didn't make me feel like a guest in my own life. But it kept circling back to my wife's face, that calm certainty, the way she spoke about our marriage like a lease she could renegotiate without my signature. Her sister, though, drove like she was carrying something fragile, which somehow made me feel more fragile too, because she was treating my silence like it mattered instead of like it was an inconvenience. When she finally asked what happened, she didn't say it like gossip, and she didn't say it like she already had a side picked, because she framed it like an honest question that could handle an honest answer. And I found myself telling her pieces I hadn't even planned to admit to myself, like how the open marriage didn't sound like a mutual experiment but like a policy change I was expected to sign off on, and how the worst part wasn't even the sex. It was the way my wife said she already had someone in mind, as if that was a small detail rather than the entire crime scene. Her sister's knuckles whitened briefly on the steering wheel, then relaxed again, and she said, "So she said it like she was offering you something, even though she was taking something." And I turned toward her because it was the first time anyone had put words to what I couldn't quite name. The road noise filled in the gaps, but the car still felt too quiet, like every exhale was being recorded. And when we stopped at a red light, she looked at me fully for the first time, her expression tight with something that wasn't anger exactly, but a kind of contained disgust. And she said, "I know my sister, and I know the way she talks when she's already decided she's the victim." And the fact that she said it so plainly sent a strange spark through me, half relief and half danger, because it meant she wasn't buying the story my wife was clearly preparing to sell. I felt my body register her presence in a way I didn't invite, noticing the clean line of her jaw when she swallowed, the way her hair was tucked behind one ear, the way she sat close enough that I could feel heat when she shifted, and it made me angry at myself because this was not the moment for attraction. Yet it was also the moment where my loneliness was finally being touched by something other than criticism. She didn't drop me off right away, even when we were close, because she turned onto a quieter street and slowed as if she needed to say something without the risk of being overheard, and then she spoke carefully, choosing every word like it mattered, which made the hairs on my arms lift because I could tell this wasn't just about giving me a ride. She said, "I need you to hear me clearly, because I'm not saying this to stir things up, and I'm not saying this because I want to be involved in your marriage, but I've been watching you two for a long time, and what she just did to you wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a move." And I let out a laugh that didn't sound like humor, more like disbelief looking for a place to land. I asked her what she meant by a move, and she hesitated, then admitted that my wife had been slippery for months, protective of her phone, protective of her time, protective of her explanations, and that the open marriage language sounded suspiciously like a pre-written excuse for something that had already crossed the line. The car rolled to a stop at the curb near our house, and for a second she didn't reach for the door locks, and neither did I, because we were both sitting inside a moment that suddenly felt bigger than the night, bigger than the fight, and I could feel how easy it would be to lean into the comfort of her attention and let it become something it shouldn't. Instead, she kept her voice low and said, "If you go back in there right now, she's going to rewrite what happened until you're apologizing for being hurt, and I don't want you walking into that alone." And I didn't answer immediately because the truth was, I didn't trust myself to speak without cracking. When I finally nodded, It wasn't agreement with an open marriage or a plan or even her suspicion. It was simply recognition that for the first time in a long time, someone was looking at me like I was a person, not a problem to manage. And as I reached for the door handle, I realized the ride hadn't just moved me across town. It had moved something inside me into a place where revenge could eventually grow. Nothing happened that night in the way people expect when they hear a story like this, which somehow made it heavier, because restraint has a way of sharpening awareness instead of dulling it. And when I went back inside the house after that drive, every familiar object felt misaligned, like the walls themselves knew something had shifted that couldn't be reversed. I lay awake listening to my wife move around the bedroom with exaggerated normalcy, humming softly as if the evening had ended in mutual understanding rather than quiet devastation, and the realization settled in slowly that she hadn't asked where I'd gone or how I felt, because she no longer needed that information to move forward. The next day unfolded with a similar unreality, with her discussing logistics and boundaries over coffee as though we were co-workers negotiating a schedule change, and when she talked about honesty, it sounded less like a value and more like a branding choice she could deploy when it suited her. It was later that afternoon, when her sister stopped by under the pretense of checking in, that the tension I had been holding in my body finally found a place to breathe. Because she didn't sit across from me like a mediator and she didn't offer platitudes, she leaned against the counter and said she had watched this marriage erode from the outside for years, watching me bend and recalibrate while her sister collected validation like it was oxygen. She spoke about attention the way some people talk about addiction, about how my wife had always needed more than was available in the room, and how opening the marriage felt less like liberation and more like a way to legitimize what she was already doing. And as she spoke, I felt a strange mixture of relief and exposure, because being understood can feel invasive when you've grown accustomed to being misunderstood. There was a current running beneath her words, an intimacy born not of touch, but of shared observation. And when our eyes met, there was a pause that lingered a fraction too long, charged not with intent, but with possibility, which made me look away because acknowledging it felt like stepping onto ice that might crack if I shifted my weight. What unsettled me most wasn't the attraction itself, but how natural it felt to be seen by someone who wasn't trying to extract agreement from me. And as she talked about moments I barely remembered, things I had brushed off as minor tensions, I realized she knew the contours of my marriage better than I did, because she had been watching without the distortion of hope. She reminded me of arguments I had smoothed over, of apologies I had accepted too quickly, of how often I had been made to feel unreasonable for wanting consistency. And when I asked her why she cared this much, why she was saying all of this now, she didn't answer right away, which made the silence thicken with something unspoken. She finally said she hated watching people be rewritten in real time, hated how narratives could be shaped until the injured party was made to feel like the aggressor, and she said it with an intensity that made me wonder how much of that anger belonged to me, and how much of it was old and personal. We stood there close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body without touching it, close enough that every small movement felt amplified, and I became acutely aware of how easily lines could blur when emotional clarity masquerades as connection. Nothing physical happened, not even a brush of fingers, but the restraint itself felt deliberate rather than awkward, and when she stepped back and told me to take care of myself, to document conversations, to trust my instincts even when they were inconvenient, I understood that she wasn't just offering comfort, she was offering information. As she left, the door closing softly behind her, it hit me that she had been carrying pieces of my marriage in her head that I had been too busy surviving to examine, and the unsettling truth settled in that the person who knew the most about what was happening to me wasn't the woman I had promised my life to, but the one person who had never made me feel like I was asking for too much by wanting to matter. By the time I walked back into the house, the air felt staged, like a set reset between scenes, because she was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a calm that felt rehearsed, legs tucked under her, wine already poured, and she looked up at me with a smile that didn't ask how I was doing, but instead checked whether I had finished processing on schedule. She started talking before I had even put my keys down, explaining how she'd been thinking more about logistics, about how transparency was important but not in a suffocating way, about how we didn't need to overshare every detail because jealousy thrived on imagination. And she said all of this with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the hard part was already over. When I asked her when exactly we had agreed to any of this, she tilted her head and sighed, telling me that I was getting stuck on semantics, that we had talked about feeling disconnected for months, that this was just the next logical step, and then she casually mentioned a dinner she had planned later in the week, saying it wasn't a date exactly, but also not a date, and that she hoped I would be mature about it. The word mature landed like an accusation, and when I told her I felt like I was being informed rather than included, she smiled again, softer this time, and said she thought I would be relieved once I stopped trying to control outcomes, which was rich coming from someone who had clearly choreographed the entire situation in advance. I could feel my chest tighten as she spoke about rules she had already decided on, about how emotions were unavoidable but manageable, about how she trusted me to handle this with grace, and it dawned on me that she wasn't asking for my permission because in her mind she already had it, not from me, but from the version of me she had reduced to someone who would eventually comply to keep the peace. It was when I mentioned, almost offhandedly, that her sister had picked me up the night before that the mask slipped, because her expression didn't shift into jealousy or concern the way I expected. It hardened into irritation, quick and sharp, like a muscle memory response, and she asked why her sister had been involved at all, as if the offense wasn't the argument that drove me out, but the inconvenience of someone else witnessing it. She accused her sister of meddling, of always thinking she knew better, and when I asked her why that bothered her so much, she deflected, saying it was inappropriate, saying boundaries mattered now more than ever, and there was something in the speed of her defensiveness that made my stomach drop. I pressed gently, asking why a ride home had triggered more reaction than her announcing plans to sleep with someone else, and she snapped that I was being dramatic, that I was trying to shift blame, and that this was exactly why the marriage needed to change, because everything turned into an interrogation with me. The conversation spiraled in familiar ways, with her reframing my confusion as resistance and my hurt as insecurity, but underneath it all was a new tension, one that buzzed louder every time her sister's name came up, because it was clear there was history there that made her uncomfortable in a way my pain never quite managed to. As she stood up and walked away mid-sentence, saying she was done talking for the night and reminding me that this was happening whether I liked it or not, I felt something settle into place with unsettling clarity, because I finally understood that the marriage hadn't been opened as a shared experiment but claimed like territory, and that whatever permission she thought she had been granted had never actually been given, only assumed, which meant that if I was going to survive what came next, I would have to stop reacting to the story she was telling and start paying attention to the one she was desperately trying to keep hidden. The message from her sister came late enough that it felt intentional, not urgent but deliberate, asking if I was awake and whether I wanted to get some air, and I remember staring at the screen longer than necessary because by then I had learned that nothing in this situation was casual anymore. Everything carried weight, even when it pretended not to. We met at a quiet bar a few neighborhoods away, not a dramatic place, just dim enough to feel private, and she didn't waste time easing into things because she ordered a drink, waited until the server walked away, and then looked at me with an expression that made it clear this wasn't about checking on my feelings anymore. She said she hadn't picked me up that night just because I looked wrecked, although that had been true, but because the conversation I described sounded too familiar, too rehearsed, like a script she had heard versions of before, and when I asked her what she meant, she leaned forward and told me that the open marriage didn't sound like exploration to her. It sounded like cover. She explained that for months she had noticed small inconsistencies, moments where my wife's stories didn't line up, where her schedule shifted without explanation, where her phone was suddenly treated like a locked room rather than a tool, and she admitted she hadn't said anything because she wasn't sure whether she was projecting or protecting. But the second she heard the phrase open marriage framed as an inevitability, something clicked into place that made her stomach drop. She told me she hadn't wanted to be right, and that was the part that made me believe her, because she spoke with frustration rather than satisfaction, laying out details she had noticed like someone reluctantly presenting evidence rather than savoring it. She said there were texts she had glimpsed by accident, Not explicit but intimate in a way that assumed secrecy, jokes that made no sense without shared context, plans that were always just vague enough to avoid accountability, and she admitted that at some point she had started paying attention not because she wanted to interfere, but because she didn't recognize her sister anymore. As she talked, I felt the room narrow around us, the sounds of other conversations fading into background noise, because every example she gave fit too neatly with the unease I had been carrying, and the worst part was realizing how hard I had worked to ignore those same signs when they brushed against my own awareness. When I asked her why she was telling me now, why she hadn't warned me earlier, she didn't deflect or soften the answer. She said she was afraid of being accused of jealousy or sabotage, afraid of being painted as the bitter sister who couldn't stand to see her sibling happy, and that fear had kept her quiet longer than she was proud of. She said watching the open marriage be introduced like a solution, rather than a confession, felt like watching a magician distract the audience while the real trick happened somewhere else. And she couldn't stand the idea of me being manipulated into thanking my wife for the honesty she was using to erase the truth. There was tension in the space between us then. Not sexual in a straightforward way, but charged with intimacy, born from shared recognition. And I became acutely aware of how close she was sitting, of how easily this moment could slide into something messier if either of us let it, which made me pull back just enough to keep my thoughts clear. She noticed, I think, because she straightened slightly and told me she wasn't trying to pull me into anything, that this wasn't about replacing one betrayal with another, but about making sure I wasn't walking blind into a situation designed to make me doubt my own perception. The clarity of her intention hit harder than any flirtation could have, because it reframed her kindness as strategy rather than impulse, and it was in that moment that the first real twist settled in my chest, the understanding that the night she picked me up hadn't been random, and that the woman I had married wasn't just drifting away, but actively rewriting the story to make her exit cleaner. As we sat there, drinks untouched, the weight of what I was being handed sank in slowly, because information like that isn't just power, it's a responsibility. And I realized that whatever came next wouldn't be about salvaging a marriage that no longer existed, but about deciding whether I would continue playing the role she had assigned me, or finally step out of it and let the truth do its quiet, devastating work. It happened gradually enough that I almost missed the moment when I stopped feeling like a husband and started feeling like an inconvenient roommate, because my wife didn't announce her emotional departure so much as she normalized my absence from her priorities, moving through the house with a lightness that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with no longer needing to pretend. She came home later and later, explanations thinning into gestures, conversations truncated by her phone lighting up in ways that made it clear the important parts of her day were happening elsewhere. And when I asked questions, she smiled in that patient, condescending way she had perfected, telling me I needed to trust the process, reminding me that jealousy was something I needed to unlearn if we were going to grow. She spoke about growth the way people speak about inevitability, like resisting it made me small, and there was a particular cruelty in being told I was failing a test I never agreed to take, especially when the grading rubric kept changing without notice. I watched her get dressed with more care than she had shown me in months, watched her rehearse casual indifference in the mirror, watched her check her reflection before leaving without ever checking whether I was okay, and the realization sank in that the open marriage wasn't creating distance. It was just giving her permission to stop pretending the distance wasn't already there. Through all of it, her sister became the one constant that didn't feel transactional, not because she was inserting herself aggressively, but because she noticed what everyone else seemed determined to overlook, like the way I flinched when my wife talked about honesty, or how I had started timing my own emotions to avoid accusations of insecurity. We talked more, never in secretive ways that would invite suspicion, but in spaces that felt neutral enough to be safe, like coffee shops or parked cars or slow walks where the conversation could wander without feeling like a trap. She listened without reframing, without fixing, and sometimes she would say things that landed so precisely they felt almost invasive, like when she told me I was being managed rather than loved, or when she pointed out how often my wife spoke about me as an obstacle instead of a partner. There was attraction there, undeniable and inconvenient, a low hum beneath the surface of our conversations that neither of us acknowledged directly, but it wasn't reckless or desperate. It was restrained in a way that made it more intense, because restraint requires awareness, and awareness breeds tension. I noticed the way her eyes softened when I talked about things I had given up to keep the peace, the way her voice lowered when she said my name, the way our conversations lingered a few seconds too long at the end, as if neither of us wanted to be the first to break the spell. And every time I felt that pull, I reminded myself that crossing that line wouldn't be revenge, it would be surrender. The breaking point came on a night my wife breezed past me in the kitchen, already halfway out the door, and casually mentioned she wouldn't be home until late, saying it like an update rather than a request. And when I asked if we could talk later, she laughed softly and said she didn't want to do heavy conversations tonight because she was finally feeling light again. Something in me snapped quietly then, not with drama, but with clarity, because I realized I was being asked to carry the emotional weight of a marriage that no longer benefited her while pretending my discomfort was a character flaw. I didn't yell, and I didn't beg. I just watched her leave, and felt the strange calm that comes when anger finally organizes itself into purpose. And when her sister texted later asking how I was holding up, I told her the truth instead of minimizing it, and she didn't rush to comfort me. She told me I wasn't crazy for feeling erased. Sitting there with my phone glowing in the dark, reading words that named what I was experiencing without softening it, I understood that I had already become the other man in my own marriage, tolerated but not chosen, and that the only power left to me was deciding how long I would continue playing a role designed to make my disappearance easier for everyone but me. She waited until we were somewhere neutral again, a quiet stretch of road overlooking nothing in particular, before she told me, and the way she asked me to pull over first should have been my warning that this wasn't just another observation or theory, but something that had been living in her chest for a long time, pressing outward until it finally demanded air. She didn't start with names or dates. She started by asking me whether I believed people could carry the same wound for years without anyone noticing, and when I told her I thought most people did exactly that, she let out a breath that sounded like relief mixed with resignation and said that was good, because what she was about to say wouldn't make sense otherwise. She told me that years ago, long before I was in the picture, she had been involved with the same man my wife was seeing now, not openly, not proudly, but in that quiet, destabilizing way where nothing is official and everything feels provisional. And she said it hadn't started as an affair then either. It had started as emotional overlap, as reassurance offered in private while public loyalty stayed intact. She explained how she had convinced herself it wasn't real, that it was just a tension, just a phase, just something that would resolve itself if she stayed quiet long enough. And as she spoke, I could hear the old self-blame threaded through her words, the familiar cadence of someone who had been taught to doubt their own experience until it collapsed into something undeniable. She told me that when the truth finally surfaced back then, it didn't explode, it dissolved, because my wife had reframed it so efficiently that the damage landed entirely on her, painting her as dramatic, as confused, as someone who read too much into harmless connection, and she admitted that she had swallowed that version because fighting it would have meant losing her sister completely. The fallout hadn't been loud, but it had been permanent, a subtle reordering of trust where everything became conditional and nothing was ever addressed directly again. And when she said she recognized the pattern this time, it wasn't because she was paranoid, but because she had lived through the first draft of this story already. I sat there absorbing that revelation, feeling the ground shift under my understanding of both women, because suddenly her sister's vigilance wasn't just concern, it was muscle memory, and her insistence on clarity wasn't altruism alone, it was survival sharpened by regret. She told me she hadn't planned to get involved this deeply, that she had hoped my wife would handle things differently with me, that she would be braver this time, kinder, more honest. But when the open marriage was introduced like a solution instead of a confession, she knew exactly what was happening and couldn't stay silent again without hating herself for it. There was a charged stillness after she finished, the kind that follows a truth that can't be taken back, and I felt anger rise not just toward my wife, but toward the entire architecture of manipulation that had allowed this to repeat itself under the guise of growth and progress. I asked her whether helping me was about getting back at her sister, and she met my eyes without flinching and said it was about refusing to be erased twice by the same lie, which was an answer that carried enough pain to be believable. The attraction between us shifted then, losing its ambiguity and gaining weight, because it was no longer just about being seen, but about being aligned against something that had already harmed us both in different ways. We didn't touch, not even then, but the restraint felt heavier, more deliberate, like holding back a door that wanted to swing open on its own. And when she finally said that whatever I decided to do next needed to be for me and not as collateral damage in a family war, I understood that the second twist wasn't just her history. It was the realization that my wife's betrayal wasn't an isolated act, but part of a pattern refined over years, and that knowing this didn't make the situation messier. It made it clearer, because once you see repetition, you stop questioning your instincts and start trusting the part of you that recognizes danger dressed up as choice. The confrontation didn't happen the way movies train you to expect, with everyone seated and prepared and the truth unveiled in a single cathartic moment, because real collapse is messier and overlapping and cruelly mundane, unfolding in fragments that refuse to line up neatly. And it started when my wife came home early one afternoon, unusually energized, talking too fast about transparency and emotional check-ins, as if she sensed something slipping and wanted to get ahead of it. She launched into a speech about how hard this transition had been for her, how misunderstood she felt, how brave she thought she was being by insisting we confront uncomfortable truths. And as she spoke, I watched her build a narrative in real time, one where she was the pioneer and I was the hesitant spouse holding her back, and I realized with chilling clarity that she believed this version so completely that any challenge to it would feel like betrayal rather than correction. I didn't interrupt right away, because I wanted to hear how far she would take it, and when she finally paused, waiting for affirmation, I asked her calmly whether honesty also included admitting that the person she was seeing hadn't entered the picture after the open marriage but long before it. The shift in her face was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a flicker of calculation behind the practiced concern, and she laughed softly, accusing me of paranoia, asking where this was coming from, and when I told her I knew more than she thought, her tone sharpened, telling me I was being influenced, that people love to project their own issues onto our marriage. It was then that her sister walked in, not dramatically but decisively, having been invited with my wife's knowledge under the assumption that this was still a salvageable family discussion, and the room tightened instantly because whatever history they shared rushed back into the space without needing to be named. What followed wasn't a clean confession, but a series of deflections collapsing under their own weight, with my wife insisting nothing physical had happened before permission existed, with her sister calmly pointing out timelines that didn't match, with me sitting between them feeling like the last person to receive a script everyone else had memorized years ago. Voices rose, not into shouting, but into that brittle intensity that comes when the truth is close enough to be dangerous, and when my wife finally snapped, accusing her sister of always wanting what she had, of never letting go of old resentments, the room went silent in a way that made the accusation hang heavy and undeniable. Her sister didn't yell back, she just said that the problem wasn't jealousy, it was repetition, and that watching the same manipulation unfold again had forced her to choose between loyalty and integrity, and she had chosen to stop lying. The mask cracked then, not into remorse but into anger, with my wife railing against being ganged up on, against being painted as a villain for wanting more, against being denied the freedom she deserved, and it struck me that even now, even exposed, she couldn't frame this as harm done to others, only as obstacles placed in her path. I stood up before the argument could spiral further, not because I had won, but because I finally understood that the story she had been telling about growth and honesty and openness had always been a shield, and once it shattered there was nothing underneath but entitlement dressed as enlightenment. Walking out of that room, leaving them mid-conflict, I felt the strange, hollow relief that comes when a narrative collapses under its own contradictions, because the devastation wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about seeing how thoroughly I had been written out of my own marriage, and knowing, with a clarity that no argument could undo, that whatever came next would not involve trying to earn a place in a story designed to move on without me. I didn't announce my decision, and I didn't frame it as a boundary or a consequence, because by then I understood that declarations were just fuel for her ability to reframe. So I waited until the house was quiet in that particular way that only happens when someone believes they've regained control. She was out again, light and buoyant, texting with the distracted confidence of someone who assumed the story had already settled in her favor. And I moved through the room slowly, touching nothing that didn't belong to me anymore, feeling the strange calm that comes when anger has finally finished sharpening itself. I packed with intention rather than urgency, folding clothes carefully, leaving behind objects that carried her fingerprints more than mine. And when I hesitated, it wasn't because I doubted the choice, but because I was surprised by how little drama the moment required. Her sister came by without ceremony, not sneaking or conspiring, just present in the way she had been since the truth started to surface, and she helped me without commentary, handing me boxes, keeping the process grounded, making sure this didn't turn into another emotional performance where I was cast as unstable or reactive. We talked quietly while we worked, about logistics and timing and what silence would mean in the coming weeks, and the absence of charged tension between us felt deliberate, almost respectful, as if we both understood that turning this into something romantic would cheapen the clarity we had fought to preserve. When my wife came home and saw the boxes, her reaction wasn't immediate outrage but disbelief, the kind that freezes someone in place because it doesn't fit the script they've been rehearsing. And she asked me what I thought I was doing with a laugh that didn't quite land, telling me this felt extreme and unnecessary. I told her I was choosing to stop participating in something that required my erasure to function, and she tried to pull the conversation back into familiar territory, accusing me of being dramatic, of letting myself be influenced, of giving up right when things were finally becoming honest. I didn't argue, and I didn't list grievances, because I knew now that the most devastating response I could offer was refusal, and I watched the realization spread across her face that I wasn't there to negotiate my role anymore. She turned to her sister then, searching for alignment, for reassurance, and when she didn't find it, something brittle cracked, because loyalty had always been her fallback, the unspoken rule that would eventually override discomfort. Her sister didn't attack or explain herself. She simply said she was done lying to keep the peace, and the simplicity of that statement landed harder than any accusation could have. Leaving felt anticlimactic in the best possible way, not triumphant, but clean. And as I closed the door behind me, I felt the weight of being cast as the wrong choice settle in, because I knew the story would continue without me, reshaped to make my absence easier to digest. I didn't try to correct it, because for the first time I understood that revenge doesn't always look like exposure or punishment. Sometimes it looks like refusing to be available for someone else's narrative maintenance. Sitting in the car with the last of my things, the night air cool and steady, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that while she still had her open marriage and her carefully managed freedom, she no longer had me as the stabilizing force that made it all look reasonable, and choosing myself, even in silence, felt like stepping off a stage where the applause had never really been meant for me anyway. The aftermath didn't arrive with fireworks or regretful late-night calls, and it didn't come with apologies that tried to rewrite what had already been exposed, because what followed was quieter and more unsettling, a slow realization that the story my wife had been telling herself no longer worked once I stopped playing my part in it. The open marriage technically still existed, at least on paper, and in her conversations with people who nodded politely and praised her bravery. But without me there to absorb the emotional labor, it lost its structure, becoming less a philosophy and more a series of logistics that no longer felt revolutionary once there was no one left to persuade. I moved into a small place that felt temporary in the best way, sparse enough to remind me that everything there was chosen intentionally, and the first few nights were strange not because I missed her, but because my nervous system didn't know what to do without constant negotiation. Silence stopped feeling like tension, and started feeling like space, and that shift alone was enough to confirm I had made the right choice, even when loneliness brushed up against me in unexpected moments. Her sister stepped back the way she said she would, not disappearing but no longer hovering, respecting the fact that whatever connection had grown between us needed distance to remain honest, and I appreciated that more than I could articulate because it meant the support she offered had never been a transaction. We talked occasionally, brief check-ins that acknowledged what we had survived without trying to turn it into something else, and the restraint between us remained, no longer charged with possibility, but grounded in mutual understanding, which felt healthier than any rushed resolution would have. As for my wife, the consequences arrived slowly, in the form of stories that didn't land the way she expected them to, of people asking questions she wasn't prepared to answer, now that the husband she referenced in past tense wasn't around to validate the narrative. I heard through mutual acquaintances that the freedom she had fought for felt different without resistance to frame it against, that empowerment loses some of its shine when there's no one left to convince, and while I didn't take pleasure in that knowledge, I didn't flinch from it either. What surprised me most was how little closure I needed once I stopped seeking permission to leave, because understanding replaced explanation, and clarity replaced hope, and those things proved sturdier than any apology would have been. I didn't feel triumphant, and I didn't feel broken. I felt recalibrated, like someone who had finally stepped out of a room with bad acoustics and realized the noise had never been their fault. The revenge, if it could be called that, wasn't dramatic exposure or public reckoning. It was absence, the quiet removal of myself from a system that required my diminishment to function, and the satisfaction came not from watching it struggle but from knowing I would never again be asked to shrink so someone else could feel expansive. I didn't win anything tangible, and I didn't reclaim a past that was already gone, but I walked away with something more durable than closure, a calm certainty about my own worth that didn't need to be argued into existence, and that was enough to let the story end without a moral, without a lesson, and without me ever needing to look back to see whether the door had finally closed.